Welcome. So we're continuing to work through Daniel chapter 11, and in this video we'll be working through verse 5. Just to recap our last video, we were introduced to Alexander the Great in verse 3, which reads, "Then a warrior king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases." And this is a perfect description of Alexander, who ruled from Greece to India. Then in verse 4, we continue to read about Alexander, quote, "And while still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted and go to others besides these." In our last video, we broke down this verse and discussed how this verse correctly tells us that Alexander's empire, after his death, is broken into four major units. Now, this video is going to be all about verse 5. Before delving into the historical context of the verse, let's just give it a read. Quote, "Then the king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger than he, and shall rule a realm greater than his own." End quote. So hopefully you can immediately appreciate that without knowing the historical context, it's really impossible to make any sense out of this verse. And that's actually true for all of Daniel chapter 11. Unless you're willing to put in the time to understand the history of this time period, the entirety of Daniel 11 will always be a mystery to you. So, what is verse 5 trying to tell us? Well, this king of the south is referring to Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, and one of his officers is referring to Seleucus, who in later verses in chapter 11 will be called the king of the north. In this video, we'll be exploring what it means when it says that his officer shall grow stronger than he and shall rule a realm greater than his own. On the face of it, it seems to be implying that at one stage Ptolemy is more powerful than Seleucus and there is some sort of reversal. So let's now dig into the history and see if this is in fact the case. And to do this, we need to rewind a bit to the time of Alexander's death. In 323 BC, Alexander dies in Babylon, and this triggers a series of conflicts between his generals for control of his empire. These conflicts are known as the Diadochi Wars, which means the War of the Successors. But war doesn't immediately break out upon the death of Alexander the Great. Rather, a conference of Alexander's officials is held in Babylon when Alexander died, to decide who will take control of the empire, and this is known as the Partition of Babylon in 323 BC. In describing this conference, I'll be quoting from two Greek historians. The first, Arrian of Nicomedia, a Greek historian writing about the 1st century AD, and the second one will be Diadochi, a Greek historian writing in about the 1st century BC. So Diadochi tells us that at the partition of Babylon, the council first decides who will replace Alexander as king. Diadochi writes, quote, "They made Arrhidaeus, son of Philip, their king, and changed his name to Philip." So Alexander's half-brother is made the king of the empire. Our other Greek historian, Arrian, adds to this, noting that Alexander's unborn son, when born, would also share the title of king with Arrhidaeus. Arrian writes, quote, "Roxanne's child, when born, if it were a son, should share the throne with him." End quote. The next role to be elected at this conference would be the regent of the empire. This role would be equivalent to a modern-day prime minister, someone who is actually in control of the government and the person who is actually calling the shots. So arguably a more important role than the king. Arrian writes, quote, "Perdiccas should be Kilarch of the troops, which amounted to entrusting him with the care of the whole empire." So this man Perdiccas is named prime minister. Diadochi confirms this, writing, quote, "Perdiccas, to whom Alexander had given his ring as he died, they made regent of the kingdom. And they decided that the most important of the friends and of the bodyguard should take over the satrapies and obey the king and Perdiccas." As the text says, they decide who of the most important of the friends and of the bodyguard should take over the satrapies. A satrapy is a territory that is governed by a leader known as a satrap. Now, at the partition of Babylon, Alexander's kingdom is not divided into four major sections. Only at the very end of this time period will four distinct regions emerge. Rather, the partition of Babylon divides the kingdom into lots of different regions. Here is a map if you are curious about all of them. Needless to say, I'm not going to read through all of them. Instead, I'll only be giving you the ones relevant to us. So, we continue to read in Diodorus, quote, "After Perdiccas had assumed the supreme command and had taken counsel with the chief men, he gave Egypt to Ptolemy. To Antigonus he gave Pamphylia, Lycia, and what is called Greater Phrygia. In Europe, Thrace and the neighbouring tribes near the Pontic Sea were given to Lysimachus, and Macedonia and the adjacent peoples were assigned to Antipater." An important figure for our purposes not mentioned here is Seleucus. He is not given a piece of territory in the Partition of Babylon. Rather, we read, quote, "He placed Seleucus in command of the cavalry of the companions, a most distinguished office," end quote. Another important fact here is that Alexander's half-brother, King Arrhidaeus, is placed in charge of the transportation of Alexander's dead body. We read, quote, "The transportation of the body of the deceased King Alexander and the preparation of the vehicle that was to carry the body to Ammon, they assigned to Arrhidaeus." Also, this coffin before you isn't actually Alexander's real coffin. His real coffin is described as being made of gold. Now, the reason why it's important we talk about the transportation of Alexander's dead body is because this is actually going to trigger the First Diadochi War, which begins in 322 BC. Arrian writes, "Arrhidaeus, who kept the body of Alexander with him, contrary to the wish of Perdiccas, took it from Babylon by way of Damascus to Ptolemy the son of Lagus." So Arrhidaeus was meant to send Alexander's body to Macedonia, but instead he sends it down to Ptolemy in Egypt, and this infuriates Perdiccas. Diodorus writes, quote, "For Perdiccas, viewing with suspicion Ptolemy's increase in power, decided that he himself and the kings would make a campaign against Egypt with most of the army." In Arrian's account, he agrees with this, noting that Perdiccas, setting out from Damascus to make war upon Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, reached Egypt with the kings and a large force. Perdiccas was slain by his own cavalry during an engagement. So as a result of the First Diadochi War, Perdiccas dies. It's also important to note here that this is very much a simplification of the First Diadochi War, as this whole video is. It's a simplification of these events. So there was, of course, more battles going on, but this is the only thing really relevant to us. So now that Perdiccas is dead, another council is called to fill this role because someone needs to be prime minister of the empire. And this is called the Partition of Arrhidaeus, which is in modern-day Lebanon. Of this partition, Diodorus writes, quote, "The guardians of the king, setting out from the Nile with the kings and the army, came to Arrhidaeus in Upper Syria. They summoned a meeting of the assembly and resigned the guardianship, whereupon the Macedonians elected Antipater guardian with full power." End quote. So Antipater, who was the satrap of Macedon, becomes the new prime minister. The council then, for a second time, divides the empire between the different generals. We read, quote, "To Ptolemy he assigned what was already his, for it was impossible to displace him, since he seemed to be holding Egypt by virtue of his own prowess, as if it was a prize of war." So as you can clearly see from the text, Ptolemy is extremely strong at this stage. We then continue to read a whole bunch of names I have no earthly idea how to pronounce, until we get to someone important, so bear with me here. He gave Syria to Laomedon of Mytilene, and Sicilia to Philoxenus. Of the upper satrapies, Mesopotamia and Arrhidaeus were given to Amphimachus, and then finally, and importantly, Babylonia to Seleucus. So this is the important part here. Seleucus is now on the map, and he is the satrap of Babylon. Okay, let's pause here for a second, because soon after taking on the role of prime minister, Antipater dies. And following his death, the empire falls into a civil war. And in the following wars, the Diadochi will battle for control of the empire. And in the course of all of these wars, the kings of the empire, Alexander's half-brother Arrhidaeus and Alexander's son, Alexander IV, will both be killed. The man who killed Alexander's son is Cassander, who will take control of Greece. Let's now focus on the Second Diadochi War, which begins in 319 BC. Diodorus writes, quote, "In Asia, as soon as the death of Antipater was noised abroad, there was first stirring of revolution, since each of those in power undertook to work for his own ends. Antigonus, who was foremost among these." Okay, let's stop the quote there for a second. So this man Antigonus, who was the governor of Phrygia in the Second Diadochi War, takes over a vast amount of the empire. Antigonus is now the most dominant figure in the empire after the Second Diadochi War. Now, after defeating his enemies, Antigonus passes through Babylon and is initially friendly with Seleucus. But things soon turn sour, and we learn about this from the Greek historian Appian. Appian tells us that Seleucus first warmly welcomes Antigonus. He writes, quote, "On his return was received in great pomp by Seleucus, the satrap in Babylonia. However, unfortunately, he continues, quote, one day Seleucus insulted an officer without consulting Antigonus, who was present. And Antigonus, out of spite, asked for accounts of his money and his possessions. Seleucus, being no match for Antigonus, withdrew to Ptolemy in Egypt. Immediately after his flight, Antigonus deposed Biltor, the governor of Mesopotamia, for letting Seleucus escape, and took over personal control of Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and all the peoples from the Medes to the Hellespont. This now leads us to the Third Diadochi War, which begins in 314 BC. Diodorus writes, quote, Seleucus, arriving safely in Egypt, met with nothing but kindness from Ptolemy. He bitterly accused Antigonus, saying that Antigonus had determined to remove from their satrapies all who were men of rank, and in particular those who had served under Alexander. As examples of this, he mentioned the slaying of Pithon, the removal of Pusentus from Persia, and his own experiences. End quote. Therefore, in order to defeat Antigonus, Ptolemy and Seleucus form an alliance with Cassander in Greece and Lysimachus in Thrace. Of this alliance, Appian writes, quote, with so much territory in his power, he became at once an object of jealousy to the other satraps, and so an alliance was formed between Seleucus, the chief instigator of the coalition, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, satrap of Thrace, and Cassander, son of Antipater, who ruled the Macedonians in his father's name. End quote. A major battle of the Third Diadochi War is the Battle of Gaza in 312 BC. In this battle, Antigonus's son, Demetrius, is defeated by Ptolemy and Seleucus. In this fight, it's also important to remember that even though Ptolemy and Seleucus are fighting together, the soldiers are Ptolemy's soldiers. Therefore, Seleucus is acting as an officer under Ptolemy in this battle. That's an important point to which we will return to later. We continue to read in Diodorus, quote, when Seleucus had been driven from Babylonia, he received him with friendship. He used to share his own prosperity with him and with his other friends. Therefore, on this occasion also, when Seleucus asked him to give him soldiers for an expedition into Babylonia, he readily consented. And in addition, he promised to aid him in every way until he should regain the satrapy that had formerly been his. Let's now pause here for a moment. Let's appreciate a few things. Firstly, Ptolemy is clearly the more powerful governor than Seleucus at this point in time, as it's Seleucus that had to flee Antigonus and seek refuge with Ptolemy. Secondly, Ptolemy clearly has more land than Seleucus. At this point in time, Ptolemy owns all of Egypt, while Seleucus is just about to regain control of Babylon. Thirdly, note that Seleucus acted as Ptolemy's officer in the Battle of Gaza, and also take note of the quote before us here, that Seleucus asked Ptolemy to give him soldiers for an expedition into Babylon. It's clear that Ptolemy is Seleucus's superior at this point in time. All of these points will be very important when we begin to analyze verse 5 of Daniel very soon. So Seleucus, with Ptolemy's soldiers, goes to reclaim Babylon. We then finally have the Fourth Diadochi War beginning in 308 BC, in which Antigonus is defeated in battle. Appian writes, quote, after Antigonus had fallen in battle, the kings who had joined with Seleucus in destroying Antigonus shared out his territory. Seleucus obtained then Syria from the Euphrates to the sea and inland Phrygia. Seleucus also became the ruler of Mesopotamia, Armenia, Seleucid Cappadocia, as it is called, the Persians, Parthians, Bactrians, Arians, and Tepurians, Sogdia, Archsio, Hyrcania, and all the neighboring peoples whom Alexander had conquered in war as far as the Indus. End quote. I really want you to take note of how much territory Seleucus now has under his control. It is now far more than Ptolemy. And appreciate what a reversal this was. Seleucus needed Ptolemy's protection and help in fighting off Antigonus, but now Seleucus has far more power than Ptolemy. Appian continues to write about Seleucus. The boundaries of his rule in Asia extended further than those of any ruler apart from Alexander. The whole land from Phrygia eastwards to the river Indus was subject to Seleucus. Having now gone through all of this history, let's now return to Daniel 11 verse 4. We should now have a newfound appreciation for the complexity behind the very simple statement that Alexander's kingdom shall be broken and divided into the four winds of heaven. Only after these Diadochi Wars do we have four major units emerging from Alexander's original kingdom. Now, for the rest of Daniel 11, we only care about the Ptolemaic kingdom in the south and the Seleucid kingdom in the north, so we can ignore Cassander and Lysimachus. Now, with all this historical context behind us, let's now return to verse 5 and give it a read. It says, "Then the king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger than he, and shall rule a realm greater than his own." This king of the south is referring to Ptolemy, who certainly grew strong over the course of the Diadochi Wars. We then continue in verse 5 to read about one of Ptolemy's officers. Now again, this makes perfect sense in light of the Diadochi Wars. Seleucus was, in a sense, an officer under Ptolemy. He sought Ptolemy's protection from Antigonus, and it was Seleucus that had to ask Ptolemy for soldiers to recapture Babylon. Goldingay writes in his commentary, quote, "One of his officers will be more powerful than he. Seleucus I. Antigonus had expanded his empire in Asia and had attacked Babylonia in 316. Seleucus had fled to Egypt and became one of Ptolemy's generals. Ptolemy and Seleucus defeated Antigonus's army at Gaza in 312. End quote. Verse 5 then continues, "This officer shall grow stronger than Ptolemy and shall rule a realm greater than his own." Again, this only makes sense in light of the Diadochi Wars. Goldingay writes, quote, "Subsequently, Seleucus not only recovered Babylon, but also gradually won control of the rest of Antigonus's empire, until after Antigonus's death at the Battle of Ipsus in 301, Seleucus ruled a greater realm than his, Ptolemy's. Indeed, the largest of the post-Alexander empires." End quote. So now we come to an end of explaining verse 5. Hopefully now, having knowledge of the Diadochi Wars, you can read verse 5 and it makes perfect sense. But the journey through Daniel chapter 11 is not yet over. We're only 5 verses into a 45-verse chapter. We are only just beginning. So if you find this type of video helpful and you want me to create more, please consider supporting me on Patreon. This video particularly took me hours upon hours to create. So if you have benefited from it, please consider checking out my Patreon page. If donating isn't something you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button and leave me a comment. And finally, make sure you're subscribed to get my next video. Thank you for watching all the way until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.